There's an old saying in the firehouse, it's not the flames that get you, it's what you don't see coming. I thought I'd seen it all. Turns out I hadn't. My name's Dallas Chapman. 62 years old, retired firefighter. Spent 35 years running into burning buildings while everyone else ran out. These days, I run a farm in Liberty Hollow, a small town where folks still nod at each other on the street and a man's word means something. I raised 4 kids on my own after my wife, Caroline, passed. Never remarried. Figured I had enough to keep me busy between the farm, the grandkids, and making sure my kids stayed on the right path. Beatrice and I had been married for 25 years. I won't sugarcoat it, we were different people by the end of it. She was always sharp, always questioning things, and over the years she started talking about how small-town life bored her. Meanwhile, I was just fine fixing tractors and teaching my grandson how to drive a stick shift. That morning, the air was crisp, the kind that cuts right through you and wakes you up better than coffee. I sat on the porch, my hands wrapped around a chipped old mug, watching the sun break over the trees. Beatrice walked past me, her phone in one hand, her other adjusting the sweater draped over her shoulders. Her phone lit up with a text. Just a second, quick as a flicker, but I caught it. Can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible. My gut tightened the way it used to when we'd pull up to a house already half-eaten by flames. You didn't have to see the fire yet to know it was there. Beatrice didn't react, didn't glance my way, just swiped the message off the screen like it was nothing. She was careful like that, always had been. I didn't say a word. Just watched as she walked back inside, humming to herself like a woman without a care in the world. A lot of men would have lost their temper right then and there. Made a scene. Thrown accusations, demanded explanations. Not me. Firefighting taught me one thing: you don't charge into a burning building without knowing where the exits are. I set my coffee down, stood up, and stretched out my hands. Big hands, scarred from years of work. Hands that once pulled people from the worst moments of their lives. Hands that raised 4 kids, carried my wife's casket, rebuilt this farm when storms nearly took it down. Hands that would, soon enough, deliver some hard-earned justice. But not yet. That morning, I kissed my granddaughter on the forehead, told my youngest boy to call if he needed anything, and drove into town like it was any other day. My first stop was Wesley Collins's shop. Wesley ran a gun and security store on Main Street, but before that, he was Liberty Hollow's best detective back when the town still had a real crime unit. I found him behind the counter, oiling up an old revolver. He looked up. "Dallas. Haven't seen you in a while." I leaned on the counter. "Got a job for you." Wesley wiped his hands with a rag, nodded for me to follow him to the back. He didn't ask questions. That's why I came to him. We sat down in his office, a cluttered space filled with gun cases, old badges, and a whiskey bottle he probably thought was well hidden. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. "Need you to find out who my wife's been seeing." Wesley's face didn't change. Just gave a slow nod like he'd been expecting it. "How sure are you?" I rubbed my jaw. 100%. He exhaled through his nose, reached for a notepad. "You want pictures, texts, or just a name?" "All of it." Wesley clicked his pen. "Gonna cost you." "Don't care." He grunted. "Give me a couple days." I shook his hand, firm and steady. "Appreciate it." By the time I walked out of Wesley's shop, my mind was clear. A storm was coming, but I'd been through worse. I drove across town to see Dexter Wilson, my accountant. Man was built like a scarecrow and had the nerves of a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. He used to do books for some crooked clients back in the day, and now he jumped at shadows, convinced the IRS was watching his every move. When I walked into his office, he nearly spilled his coffee. "Dallas. Didn't expect you." I pulled up a chair. "Need you to look into Beatrice's spending. Find out if she's got a hotel room she's been paying for." Dexter gulped. "Dallas, man, I don't..." I leveled him with a stare. "Not asking you to do anything illegal. Just check our joint accounts. You already have access." He swallowed hard, wiped his forehead, and turned to his computer. A few clicks later, he paled. "Dallas, she's been renting a room in Charleston. Regularly." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe slow. "How long?" "Last 6 months." I nodded once, stood up. "Keep this between us." "Dallas," he hesitated, rubbing his temples. "You sure you don't wanna?" "I'm sure." By the time I stepped outside, the sky had turned gray, the wind picking up. A storm coming in. Fitting. I wasn't a fool. I wasn't one of those men who believed in second chances when someone crossed a line like this. No speeches, no long-winded conversations about why. I already knew the why. Beatrice wanted something different. Thought I was too predictable, too steady. I had no interest in winning her back. I was interested in burning her world down the way she burned mine. and I'd make damn sure she never saw it coming. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel, mind running through every angle like a firefighter sizing up a blaze before making the first move. 6 months. 6 damn months of hotel rooms and secret messages. And she thought she was smart enough to keep it hidden. Beatrice was home when I got back, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, flipping through some travel magazine like she had all the time in the world. She glanced up, gave me a half smile. "How was your day?" I shrugged, dropping my keys on the counter. "Same as always." "You?" She stretched, rolling her shoulders. "Busy. Long day at the bookstore. We had a shipment come in late." I nodded like I believed her. That was the thing about liars, they didn't stumble if they'd been lying long enough. They kept it smooth, easy, made it sound like just another part of life. I let her words settle, didn't push. She took another sip of wine, eyes back on the magazine, flipping through pages of places she'd never take me. Upstairs, I locked the bedroom door, sat down at my desk, and started organizing everything Wesley and Dexter had sent over. Receipts, transaction records, pictures. Zeke Young, 43. University professor. Taught literature at Charleston College, made a name for himself with some book on rebellion and free thought. Married to Violet Young, whose family had more money than God. I scrolled through the texts Wesley pulled from Beatrice's burner phone. They weren't sloppy. Nothing that spelled it out clear, but I knew what I was looking at. They met when she started attending his intellectual discussions on Thursday nights. Thought-provoking conversations over wine. That's what she had told me months ago when she first mentioned the group. I sat back in my chair, exhaling slow. Beatrice wasn't stupid. She didn't want some young pretty boy or a fling with a bartender who'd make her feel wanted for a few weeks. No, she wanted something that made her feel smarter. Different. Wanted in a way that didn't seem cheap. Young gave her that. He let her feel like she was breaking free of something. I wasn't about to let her believe that for much longer. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I moved through the house the way I always did, making coffee, feeding the dogs, checking the weather before heading out to the barn. Beatrice barely stirred when I left the bedroom, which meant she either slept easy or she was faking. Either way, she didn't ask where I was going, and I didn't offer it. By noon, I was back in town, meeting Wesley at the diner. He was already at a booth in the back, eating a club sandwich like he hadn't had a meal in a week. I slid into the seat across from him, nodding toward the manila folder sitting next to his plate. "That everything?" He wiped his mouth with a napkin, pushed the folder toward me. "Everything you asked for. That guy's got his hands in all kinds of shit. Turns out he's been sniffing around for a grant that his wife's family controls. Wants to leave teaching, start some intellectual retreat in the mountains, writing and talking philosophy while rich donors keep his lights on." I opened the folder, flipping through the details. "And Beatrice?" Wesley shook his head. "Thinks she's special. He feeds her all the freedom talk, makes her feel like she's part of something big. But he's using her, same as everyone else. Keeps her at arm's length enough that if she becomes a problem, he can cut her off clean." I closed the folder, nodding. "Good." Wesley leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What's your next move?" I exhaled, thinking. "First, I tighten the screws. Cut off any access she's got to my money. Then I make sure Young's life gets complicated. His wife's gonna find out soon. And when she does, he'll have bigger problems than Beatrice." Wesley smirked. "Cold, Dallas?" I met his eyes. "Not cold. Just controlled." He chuckled, shaking his head. "All right. Just make sure when you burn the place down, you don't get caught in the fire yourself." I didn't plan to. By the time I got home, Beatrice was in the kitchen making dinner. Something simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. She always cooked when she had something on her mind, something she wasn't ready to say out loud. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, leaned against the counter, watching her move. She finally glanced up. "Something wrong?" "Why would something be wrong?" She gave a small shrug, turning back to the stove. "You've been quiet." I took a sip of my beer, letting the moment stretch. "Just thinking about money. Tightening up a few things." She hesitated just for a second. "But it was there." "Like what?" "Nothing you need to worry about," I said, watching her carefully. "Just making sure everything's in order." That was the first real crack I saw. The first flicker of worry behind her eyes. She didn't know yet, but something in her gut told her to be nervous. Good. The next day, I met Dexter again. He was jittery, shifting in his seat at his office like a man who'd had too much coffee and too little sleep. "Dallas, man, I did what you asked. Froze the accounts she had access to, but she's gonna notice soon." I nodded. "That's the idea. And when she does?" I stood up. slipping my hands into my pockets. Then I see how she reacts. Dexter wiped a hand down his face. I still say you should talk to her. End it clean. I shook my head. She didn't give me that courtesy. I'm not gonna yell and I'm not gonna beg. But I'll make sure she knows exactly what she lost. That night I waited. Beatrice didn't notice at first. Not until she tried to order something online and the card declined. She brushed it off, tried again. Same result. By the time she checked our accounts, I was already sitting in the living room, watching the fire burn low in the fireplace. She came in, phone in her hand, voice tight. Dallas, something's wrong with the accounts. I didn't move, didn't look at her. No, nothing's wrong. I just made some changes. She froze. What kind of changes? I finally turned my head, met her eyes. The kind that protect me from mistakes I didn't make. For the first time in a long time, Beatrice looked unsure. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, gripping the phone tighter. She was putting the pieces together now, understanding, finally, that the ground beneath her wasn't as solid as she thought. She took a breath, steadying herself. Dallas, what's going on? I let the silence stretch, let her sit in it. Then I stood, walked past her, and headed for the door. You tell me, Beatrice. I didn't wait for her answer. Didn't need to, because soon enough, she was going to see exactly what I already knew. Her little world was about to burn, and I'd be the one holding the match. Beatrice didn't bring it up again that night. She sat across from me at the dinner table, picking at her food like she had something to say but didn't know how to say it. I let her sit with it. Didn't push, didn't prod. Just sat there, eating my steak and sipping my beer like nothing had changed. But things had changed. The next morning, she left early. Claimed she had an errand to run. But I knew better. She was going to figure out just how deep this went. I gave it an hour before checking the security cameras I'd installed last week. Sure enough, there she was, sitting in her car outside the bank, phone to her ear, face tense. She was making calls, trying to understand what had happened to her access to our money. That told me two things. One, she hadn't confided in Zeke yet, which meant she wasn't sure what to say. And two, she thought she could fix this before I noticed. I shut the laptop and finished my coffee. Time to make the next move. By noon, I was in Charleston, parking my truck a few blocks away from a small brick office building with Young and Associates on the door. Zeke's wife, Violet Young, ran a high-end real estate investment firm, managing properties for some of the richest families in the state. A woman like that didn't get to where she was by being blind. I had a feeling she suspected something, just not enough to confirm it. I walked into the lobby, straightened my jacket, and approached the receptionist, a young woman with a stiff posture and a rehearsed smile. I'd like to speak with Mrs. Young. Tell her it's regarding her husband. The woman hesitated, giving me a once-over. Do you have an appointment? No, but trust me, she's going to want to hear what I have to say. A few minutes later, I was sitting in Violet Young's office, across from a woman who looked like she belonged in a courtroom rather than a boardroom. Sharp eyes, perfectly tailored suit, the kind of woman who didn't tolerate nonsense. She folded her hands on the desk and studied me like I was an investment she wasn't sure about. Who are you? She asked. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice level. Dallas Chapman. My wife has been sleeping with your husband. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp or cover her mouth like some woman in a soap opera. She just exhaled slowly, the only sign that my words had landed. Then she reached for a drawer, pulled out a glass, and poured herself a drink. How long? She asked. 6 months, maybe longer. I slid the folder across the desk. All the proof you need is in there. She picked it up, flipping through the contents with the same cold efficiency she probably used to assess million-dollar contracts. When she was done, she set it aside and met my eyes. What do you want, Mr. Chapman? I want him to suffer, I said plainly. I want him to lose what he thinks he can't. Her lips curled slightly at that, the closest thing to amusement I'd seen from her. And what do you propose? I folded my arms. That depends. How much do you want to ruin him? Violet tapped her fingers against the desk, considering. Then she smiled, a slow, deliberate thing. Tell me what you have in mind. By the time I walked out of that office, I had exactly what I needed. Violet had already suspected Zeke was unfaithful. She just hadn't had proof. Now that she did, she was going to play her part perfectly. Zeke had built his whole career on Violet's wealth and influence, using her connections to fund his projects, his books, his entire life. And now she was about to pull the rug out from under him. I didn't need to do much. Just give her the match and let her strike it. The next day, Beatrice was in the kitchen when I got home, arms crossed, waiting. She'd found out. You froze my accounts? Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. I set my keys down on the counter, meeting her eyes. There are accounts, Beatrice. And I decided I didn't want my money funding your hotel stays anymore. Her jaw tightened. You're being ridiculous. Am I? I took a step closer, my voice lowering. Tell me, Beatrice. Where were you last Thursday? She swallowed, glancing away for half a second before catching herself. I was at the bookstore. I let the silence drag, let her sit in her own lie. Then I shook my head. No. You weren't. Her fingers curled into fists. You don't get to control me, Dallas. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. I don't need to. You already handed me everything I needed. For the first time since this started, she looked afraid. Not scared like she thought I'd hurt her, she knew better than that. But scared because she knew I wasn't bluffing. You don't understand, she said, shaking her head. It's not about you. It's about me. I exhaled through my nose, nodding slowly. That much is obvious. She sighed, rubbing her forehead. Dallas, we haven't been happy for years. I tilted my head. Maybe. But I didn't lie about it. She hesitated, lips pressing together. So what happens now? I grabbed a beer from the fridge, twisted the cap off, and took a slow sip before answering. Yeah? You find out what it feels like to lose something you thought was yours. I left her standing there because there was nothing else to say. She wanted to play this game. She thought she had control. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. Beatrice stayed quiet the rest of the evening. I could feel her thinking, calculating, trying to find a way to flip this back in her favor. That was the thing about people like her, they never saw the end coming until it was too late. By morning, she was gone before I woke up. I didn't need to guess where she went. She was either meeting Zeke or trying to get her money back. Either way, it didn't matter. The damage was already done. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and watched the sun come up through the window. One thing I knew for sure, today was going to be a long one. By noon, I got the call I'd been waiting for. Wesley's voice had that amused edge to it when he spoke. You're gonna love this. Your boy Young had a real bad morning. I leaned back in my chair, smirking. Oh yeah? Oh yeah. His wife cut off every dime she was funneling into his accounts, closed out the joint investments, froze his personal credit lines, and kicked him out of their house. Word is, she already had her lawyers on standby. And that's not even the best part. I took a sip of my coffee. Do tell. Somehow, Wesley continued, the university board got an anonymous tip about a professor engaging in inappropriate relationships with female students. Turns out Zeke's extracurriculars weren't just limited to your wife. I let out a low chuckle. That right? He's on administrative leave while they investigate. And let's just say, I don't think his tenure's gonna save him. I exhaled through my nose, nodding. Good. Wesley let the silence stretch for a moment before asking, what about Beatrice? She'll figure it out soon enough, I said. And she did. By the time I got home, she was pacing in the living room, phone clutched in her hand, face flushed with frustration. She looked up when I walked in, eyes sharp, desperate to act like she still had control. What did you do? I tossed my keys on the counter, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and took my time opening it. What are you talking about? She took a step closer, practically vibrating with anger. Violet froze his money. She's divorcing him. And somehow, the university found out about. She stopped herself, swallowing hard, catching the slip too late. I raised an eyebrow. About what? Her mouth pressed into a thin line. I leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip. You know, Beatrice, for someone who prides herself on being so damn smart, you sure made a lot of stupid decisions. She crossed her arms. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I shrugged. You reap what you sow. She let out a bitter laugh. God, you really think you're the victim here? I set the beer down and straightened, stepping toward her just enough to make her feel it. No, Beatrice. I think I'm the one who handled it. She didn't say anything to that, because she knew it was true. For a long moment, she just stared at me, her jaw tight, her breathing shallow. Then, slowly, her shoulders dropped. Not in defeat, not yet, but in realization. The game was over and I was the one still standing. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again. So what happens now? I studied her, the woman I had once built a life with, now nothing more than a stranger who thought she was smarter than she really was. That's up to you, I said. But whatever you're thinking, don't. She swallowed hard, understanding settling in. Then, without another word, she turned and walked upstairs. I watched her go, took another sip of my beer, and let out a slow breath. It wasn't over yet. But the fire was dying, and Beatrice was the one left standing in the ashes. The days after the blow-up weren't nearly as satisfying as I thought they'd be. Beatrice didn't stick around much after that conversation. She spent more time at her sister's house in town, trying to patch things up with her family, probably plotting her next move. I didn't care much about where she went. As long as she wasn't under my roof, I could focus on the farm. That's where my head had to be now. There was no room for anything else. By Friday, I was up before the sun, handling the animals, checking the fences, and making sure everything was running as it should. The farm wasn't just something I ran, it was something I loved. When everything else in life felt like it was falling apart, the farm was constant. A place where I could count on things to stay the same. Around noon, I was out by the barn when I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. I didn't look up until the truck pulled into the driveway. I knew it was her before I even saw the dust cloud. Beatrice stepped out of her car, her posture stiff. She'd changed her clothes, probably hoping I'd see her in something a little more put together. The attempt at looking composed didn't fool me. She was still wearing that air of guilt, the kind you could feel across a room. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked toward her, not bothering to hide my irritation. "What do you want, Beatrice?" She cleared her throat, looking anywhere but at me. "I came to talk." I crossed my arms. I didn't think there was anything left to talk about. She took a deep breath, the kind that comes from trying to steady yourself before saying something you know will only make things worse. "Look, Dallas. I didn't think it would go this far. I wasn't planning for any of this to happen." I let out a low chuckle, more out of disbelief than humor. "You didn't plan on it?" "Funny, because everything I've seen says you had it all planned out." Her shoulders slumped, and for a second I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the lies, the deceit, and the mess she'd made of everything. "Please," she said, her voice breaking just a little. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen like this. It wasn't supposed to be like this." I stepped a little closer, keeping my voice steady. "You didn't mean for it? You've been doing this for months, Beatrice. Lying to me, sneaking around, acting like I was just supposed to be okay with it." She flinched at the words but didn't try to argue. She just looked at me, her eyes full of something, a regret, maybe, or fear. "I don't know what to say, Dallas." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I messed up. I know I did." I stared at her for a long time, letting the silence settle. Then I shook my head, pulling my hands out of my pockets. "You think saying that's gonna fix anything?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted to say it out loud. I didn't have to say anything else. The truth was already in the air, hanging there like smoke. She didn't have anything to offer me. Nothing that could undo what had been done. "Dallas," she started again, her voice shaking, "please, I'm so sorry." I stood there, watching her for a moment. I didn't need her apology. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for something I wasn't about to give her, a chance to fix something that was already broken. I took a deep breath and finally spoke. "It's done, Beatrice. Don't come back here. Ever." She opened her mouth like she was going to argue or beg or do something. But there was no point. She could say whatever she wanted, but it wouldn't change anything. With that, I turned and walked back to the barn, leaving her standing in the driveway. I didn't look back. The next few days passed in a blur. Beatrice didn't return, but I wasn't sure if I expected her to. She had too much pride to crawl back. She was the type who would fight for what she thought she deserved. But she didn't deserve my forgiveness. That part of me was gone. She'd made her bed, and now she was lying in it. By Sunday, I'd heard the whispers around town. Some of it came through the grapevine, friends, family, neighbors, all talking about what had happened. Word had spread fast, and it didn't take long for people to start distancing themselves from Beatrice. Her friends, the ones who used to laugh and gossip with her at the local coffee shop, were suddenly too busy to talk. The things they used to admire in her, the way she carried herself, her sharp wit, had turned into something they were no longer comfortable with. I had to admit it felt good watching the tide turn. But I didn't let it get to me. I didn't need anyone else's validation to know I'd done the right thing. I spent most of the week working on the farm, like I always did. I had my kids visit on Saturday and the grandkids came by in the afternoon. We spent the day fishing and barbecuing, just like we always did. I didn't feel bad about any of it. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't upset. I was just done. And Beatrice? She was still out there, but I wasn't going to worry about her. I had my life, my farm, my family. That was all that mattered now. Whatever she had left to figure out, it wasn't my problem. By the time the dust had settled, I knew I was done with the past. Beatrice's apology, her pleading, all of it didn't matter anymore. I'd moved on. She could keep her guilt and her regrets, but I wasn't carrying them for her. I had enough on my plate. It was midweek when I got a call from Zoe Cooper. She and I had known each other for years. She ran the cattle ranch on the edge of town, not too far from my farm. We'd crossed paths at a few community events, shared a drink at the local bar now and then, but never anything more than that. Until now. She was direct, as always. Dallas, I heard about Beatrice. I don't know what happened, but if you need someone to talk to, well, I'm here. I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but I appreciated the call. Zoe didn't sugarcoat anything. She wasn't the type to tell you what you wanted to hear. She told you the truth, whether you liked it or not. I'm good, Zoe. Just trying to keep my head down and focus on what matters, I said. I get it, she replied, her voice steady. But you don't have to do it alone, Dallas. You've got people here who care about you. I paused, considering it for a moment. I appreciate that. I'm just busy, you know? The farm's got its hands full. That's fine, she said, like it was no big deal. But don't let it eat at you. You're not alone in this. I could hear the unspoken message there. Zoe was always one for quiet support, never one to force things. I respected that. I wasn't looking for anything to fix me. I didn't need it. But a part of me knew that she was right. Just because you don't want help doesn't mean you should push it away completely. The next evening, Zoe called again, but this time she wasn't just offering company. She had a proposition. How about we go out for dinner tomorrow? A quiet place, just you and me, talk about something that doesn't involve drama. I thought about it for a second. Zoe wasn't trying to get me to talk about Beatrice or my situation or anything like that. She just wanted to offer a bit of normal. Maybe it was time I took the offer. All right, I said. Sounds like a good idea. We met the next night at the Silver Creek, a small diner on the edge of town where folks went for a decent meal and good conversation. Zoe was already there when I walked in, sitting at a corner booth with a cold beer in front of her. She smiled when she saw me, but it wasn't one of those forced, polite smiles. It was just easy. I slid into the booth across from her. This place still make that meatloaf? Best in town, she replied, picking up her beer. But you won't catch me ordering it. Too rich for my blood. I chuckled. I'm not here for the sideshow. Just food. We didn't dive into the heavy stuff right away. Instead, we talked about simple things, the weather, the state of the local crops, the latest nonsense coming out of the mayor's office. It felt good not to have to worry about the things I'd been carrying. I'd done enough of that already. After dinner, as we were finishing our drinks, Zoe leaned back in the booth, her arms crossed. You know, Dallas, you're not the only one who's been through it. I raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah? She nodded. My ex-husband and I split up a few years ago. Didn't end well, but it was for the best. I didn't know Zoe's past that well, but I had heard bits and pieces over the years. Her ex had been a rancher, always getting into trouble with land deals and debts. Didn't surprise me that it hadn't worked out. Sounds familiar, I said, taking a sip of my beer. She gave a small, knowing smile. I'm not here to swap war stories, Dallas. Just want you to know that there's life after the mess. I know that, I said, but it felt different hearing it from her. She wasn't trying to fix me, wasn't telling me what I should do. She just said it like it was a simple fact. We sat in silence for a moment, letting the quiet settle in. There was no rush to fill the space with words. I like that. When I finally stood up to leave, Zoe slipped out of the booth with me, walking to the door. You don't have to go through this alone, Dallas. I know. She didn't say anything more, just nodded, a silent understanding passing between us. I didn't need to explain myself, and she didn't need to push. As I drove home that night, I felt lighter than I had in days. Maybe it was the company, maybe it was the food, but I knew it wasn't about the conversation. It was about something else, about realizing that I didn't have to carry all this weight alone. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there for a minute. The house was quiet, the lights off, but everything felt right. The storm had passed. I was still standing. And the next chapter? Well, I was going to take it on my own terms. No looking back. The days blurred together after that, one rolling into the next, and soon enough it was hard to remember what life was like before everything blew up. The farm kept me busy, the seasons changed, and the air always smelled like earth and hay, a reminder of what truly mattered. Life had a way of moving forward, whether you were ready or not, and I was learning how to take it in stride. A month passed before I heard anything from Beatrice. Not a peep. She hadn't come by the house, hadn't called. She kept her distance, and I didn't care to chase her down. Whatever she was dealing with, it wasn't my problem anymore. I didn't need her to explain anything. The facts were laid out and I had made my choice. I'd heard through the grapevine that she was back in Charleston, staying with a friend, trying to rebuild some part of her life. Zeke was still trying to salvage his career, but I heard the whispers in town. His wife's lawyers were digging into his finances and the university was already planning to part ways with him. Good riddance. Then, one day, I saw her in town. Beatrice. She was standing outside the post office, talking to Carrie, the local librarian. She looked thinner, her face harder, like the weight of everything that had happened was finally sinking in. She didn't see me at first, but when she did, her expression shifted just for a second. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was more like she was measuring me, trying to figure out if I had any lingering feelings. I didn't. I kept walking, didn't acknowledge her, didn't slow down. It wasn't a power move. It was just the truth. Beatrice was a ghost to me now. I didn't need closure from her. The only thing that mattered was that I'd moved on and so had the rest of my life. By the time I got back to the farm that afternoon, I was more at peace than I'd been in years. The place was still the same, quiet, settled, and exactly what I needed. I got to work right away, moving the hay bales from the barn to the shed, tightening up the fence where the goats had gotten too curious. I wasn't rushing through it. It felt good to have my hands busy again. That evening I got a message from Wesley. It was brief, like most of our conversations, but this one carried more weight than usual. Got the paperwork. Beatrice tried to play the victim, but her lawyer got caught lying about the property settlements. It's over. She's out of your life for good. I didn't need to read between the lines. I knew what it meant. Beatrice had tried to set me up with some fake claims about financial misdeeds, hoping to pin some of the mess on me. But Wesley had been sharp. He'd kept everything documented, every conversation, every detail, and in the end, it was her who got exposed. I set the phone down, stared at the fields outside my window. Everything that had happened, all the pain, the anger, it was over. And in a way, it had worked out the way it should have. Beatrice got what she deserved and I was still standing. The next day, Zoe stopped by with a quick hello. Nothing heavy. Just a quiet moment to check in. She was as steady as always, and when I opened the door, she handed me a bottle of whiskey. Figured we could toast to the end of a chapter. I took the bottle, unscrewed the cap, and poured us both a drink. The sunlight was fading, the night creeping in, but it felt like we were both just fine with that. To good decisions, I said. Zoe raised her glass. To moving on and doing it right. We drank. It wasn't about the whiskey. It wasn't about what we said. It was just about being in the moment, understanding that everything else was in the rearview. A few weeks later, I saw Beatrice's name in the local paper. She'd been spotted leaving town, heading back to Charleston. No fanfare, no dramatic goodbyes. It was just a line in a column about people who came and went. I smiled to myself. My life was better for it. I was better for it. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her to make things right. She had already shown me who she was, and I had made sure she paid for it. There was no room for weakness anymore. No more second chances. I didn't even think about it anymore. I didn't have to. And when I walked out the door each morning to tend the farm, I felt a little lighter, a little stronger. I was still standing. And that was enough.